They say land remembers. Maybe that's why I could still feel my wife's presence every time I stepped onto the porch of our lake cabin. The way the floor creaked under my boots, the scent of cedar soaked into the old beams, and the morning light that filtered through the same lace curtains she hung 15 years ago. That cabin wasn't just a building. It was the last piece of her that still felt alive in the world. I'm not one for drama. After retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers, I'd chosen peace over conflict fishing over phone calls and solitude over suburban small talk. So when I inherited that narrow stretch of lakefront property outside Willow Bend Ridge, tucked just past the HOA's official jurisdiction, I thought I'd found sanctuary. The property line was old, predating the formation of the Willow Bend Ridge HOA by several decades, and though the paved road ended where the HOA's influence thinned, my gravel path curved quietly toward the water like it had always been there. I kept to myself. I paid my county taxes. I kept the grass trimmed and the trail clear for the occasional hiker. My cabin had no internet, no satellite dish, and no ornamental landscaping. Just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and a stone bench my wife carved her name into after the cancer went into remission, though it didn't stay there for long. The trouble didn't start big. It never does. The first letter came in a glossy envelope with the HOA's gold-stamped seal on it. Dear homeowner, it began already a mistake since I wasn't one of theirs. It informed me of a voluntary survey of properties adjacent to HOA boundaries and invited me to review aesthetic standards being considered for the greater Willow Bend lakefront community. I tossed it, figured it was some real estate nonsense or an overreach with no teeth. Then came the second letter and the third, each one a little firmer. They said my cabin lacked visual harmony with community design. They mentioned unpermitted structures and maintenance concerns. I started keeping the envelopes. I made a folder. Still, I didn't respond. I knew they didn't have jurisdiction. I should have responded. The woman behind all this was Karen Whitmore. I didn't know her yet, not really, but I'd seen her. Tall always in a red HOA-branded windbreaker even on sunny days, clipboard in hand, walking like she owned every blade of grass she passed. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. Just took notes as if the whole neighborhood was some field report on how things failed to meet her standards. Once, I saw her from my canoe. She was standing at the edge of the HOA-maintained trail that skirted the public side of the lake. She stared at my dock as I tied the boat up, then disappeared into the woods with her phone held high like she was taking pictures. That day, I got a letter about unauthorized shoreline alterations. I brought out the plat maps. My father had given them to me when I was 26. Original surveys from the 1970s, notarized and recorded with the county with easement diagrams and handwritten notes in my grandfather's pen. My property included 50 feet of shoreline and the inlet gate to a water control valve system my great-uncle had installed before World War II to irrigate his adjacent farmland. That farmland had long since been leased out to a commercial grower who sold to the HOA for their neighborhood agriculture program. In other words, I owned the water they used to grow their soybeans. Still, I kept my head down. I wasn't interested in war, just my mornings by the water and quiet nights by the wood stove. When they started leaving printed notices on my gate, I ignored them. When a HOA compliance officer knocked and tried to hand me a corrective action plan, I told him to get off my land. He took photos as he backed away. I knew what they were trying to do: build a paper trail, make it look like I was non-compliant so they could escalate to the county. What they didn't understand was that my land wasn't within their purview, and I had no intention of attending one of their little hearings in a community clubhouse I wasn't part of. Then came the week I went into town for supplies. When I returned, something felt wrong before I even reached the clearing. There was a sharpness in the air, a wrongness. No birdsong, no rustling squirrels, just stillness. And then I saw it. My cabin, the place I built with my wife's hands beside mine, the porch where I held her the night before she passed the stone bench she carved, was gone, leveled. In its place stood a yellow caution sign staked into the soil. Structure deemed unsafe, removed under emergency action. Willow Bend Ridge, HOA. A second laminated notice had been zip-tied to a post. immediate safety remediation. The smell of disturbed earth hit me before my knees did. My legs buckled as I staggered through the flattened rubble. They hadn't even bothered to move the foundation stones. Just smashed everything, dragged it out with heavy machinery, and left behind splinters, mud, and silence. I don't remember sitting down, but when I looked up, the sun was already setting, and my fists were coated in dirt. A part of me broke open in that moment, something deeper than anger, older than pride. My wife was gone again, and this time, it wasn't illness. It was arrogance. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the lake with the plat maps in my lap and a lantern by my feet. My eyes burned, but I read every clause, every easement, every signature. I highlighted the code identifying the water rights. Then I walked down to the old irrigation valve, ran my hand along the rusted steel casing, and opened the lock. The hiss of the pipe echoed across the lake. They wanted a fight. They were about to find out I didn't lose well. The next morning, I stood at the edge of what used to be my porch, watching the mist rise off the lake like smoke from a funeral pyre. I hadn't cried. Not when I came back to rubble. Not when I found the bench split clean down the center, my wife's name sheared off by a backhoe. But that morning, I came close. There was a silence in the land that didn't feel natural. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind held its breath. Then I heard tires on gravel. A white Ford Explorer with the HOA crest printed on the side rolled up slow like it had all the authority in the world. The door opened and out stepped Karen Whitmore herself, flanked by a man in khakis and a neon vest labeled Property Standards Officer. She wore that same red windbreaker stiff with starch and arrogance, and carried a leather binder so thick it looked like a weapon. "Mr. Mayfield," she said crisply. Stepping onto my property like she owned it, we attempted multiple times to communicate our concerns. Since we received no cooperation, we were forced to act in the best interest of the community. I didn't answer. I was still staring at the pit where my wood stove had been. She mistook my silence for surrender. "You were given notice," she continued, flipping through the binder. "Your structure violated lakefront aesthetics, encroached on unzoned buffer zones, and posed safety concerns per Section 9A of the Willow Bend Ridge Design Covenants. Emergency removal was warranted under subsection Stop Talking," I said. She blinked. I turned to her fully then. "You're not law enforcement. You're not county. You're not even on my deed." Karen looked irritated, like she'd been bitten by a fly she couldn't swat. "We operate under full authority granted by the Willow Bend Ridge Covenant Charter and our municipal recognized bylaws. You are technically adjacent to our district. Adjacent isn't within." I cut in. She sighed. "We have a cooperative agreement with the county that allows emergency action when health or safety is compromised near shared use resources like this lake. We submitted a complaint of hazardous non-compliance and took action." "You submitted a complaint to yourselves," I said flatly. She didn't like that. Her cheeks flushed, but she stayed composed. "There are channels for appeal," she said. "You're welcome to file a formal response through the HOA Dispute Committee." I almost laughed. "You tore down my home and want me to submit paperwork to your private club." The man beside her, the so-called officer, shifted uncomfortably. I looked down at the lake. "You ever wonder where your soy fields get their water?" I asked, voice low. Karen frowned. "They're irrigated from the east side ag lines. Community water allotment." "Wrong," I said, still not looking at her. "That system is older than your HOA. It was built by my great-uncle in 1942. Updated by the state with my team in 91. The intake valve sits on my property, and the deeded rights are still in my name. You've been using my water for over a decade under a grandfathered lease agreement the HOA never bothered to check." Now she looked nervous. "Under county law," I continued, "I am allowed to regulate flow during periods of dispute or environmental concern. You demolished a private cabin built pre-charter. You trespassed. And now your soybeans are about to get very, very thirsty." The silence that followed was glorious. Karen narrowed her eyes. "You're bluffing." "I'm not." She reached for her phone. "We'll escalate this. You're in violation of water equity statutes. You go ahead and call the county. I said, finally turning to meet her eyes. Ask for Charlie Rutledge. He was my supervisor in the Department of Natural Resources. He signed the rights transfer to me in 2003. He'll tell you exactly what I'm allowed to do. Karen's face froze. She didn't move, but her grip on the phone changed. Like she suddenly realized I wasn't just some old man with a tattered flag and a shotgun in the shed. I was someone who'd been quiet, not because I was weak, but because I knew how to strike clean. They left not long after that, their SUV kicking up a storm of dust on the way out. Karen didn't say goodbye. The man in the vest gave me a look, half pity, half fear. I walked down to the valve box and tightened the lock. The flow was already reduced to a third. By the next week, the reduction would become noticeable. Fields that had once been a brilliant green would fade. Drip lines would sputter, leaves would curl, and with every inch of dry soil, the HOA would learn what it meant to burn a man's home and forget what he owns underneath. I didn't do it out of revenge. Not at first. I did it because the cabin deserved something. A response, a reckoning. My wife's name was gone from the stone, but I still remembered every letter. Later that week, a new letter arrived. This one was thicker. Certified. Cease and desist, it said, in bold font across the top. It accused me of intentional water withholding, agricultural sabotage, and malicious non-compliance. It was signed by Karen herself. I called Charlie Rutledge. He picked up on the second ring. Thought I might hear from you, he said. Heard something went down by Willow Bend. They tore down the cabin, Charlie. There was a pause. Hell, he muttered. You got the valve shut, restricted to 1/3. Good. Leave it. Let them try to fight it. That agreement predates their whole development. They've got no leg to stand on, and if they push it, I'll send a hydrologist out to confirm. Thanks, I said. You always said you'd retire quiet, Harlan. Guess quiet's over. Yeah, I murmured. Guess it is. The next time I drove into town, I noticed something new on the bulletin board at the diner: emergency HOA meeting. AG crop crisis. Community response needed. They'd put out the signal. But I wasn't the one in trouble. 2 weeks before they brought the machines, I had a choice. I found the envelope wedged in the gate latch, white thick, and lined with red trim, like a warning flare. I remember the morning exactly. The air still held that brittle edge of early spring, and the lake was calm, the surface like a sheet of glass, broken only by the ripple of a passing duck. I had just come back from walking the ridge trail when I saw the paper. It was from the HOA. Again. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the table in the cabin next to the little ceramic jar where my wife used to keep loose change, and I stared at it like it might dissolve on its own. I told myself it was just more empty words, another round of bureaucratic bark without bite. I knew better. But after years of discipline and decades following orders, something in me had turned rigid. I believed in rules, the real ones, the ones signed at the courthouse, registered in the county archives, and printed on plat maps. Not the kind self-appointed committees invented to feel powerful. Still later that night, I gave in. The letter was dense, 5 pages of citations, diagrams, and photos taken from across the lake. There were underlined words like unauthorized modifications, incompatible design elements, and failure to comply with established lakefront aesthetic regulations. They referred to my dock as a visual intrusion and my roofline as an obstruction of HOA-maintained scenic corridors. I laughed bitterly at that one. The final page was marked Final Notice. It threatened emergency remediation under HOA Resolution 1378B. The last sentence hit like a hammer. Failure to comply will result in immediate corrective action without further notification, as allowed under emergency authority provisions ratified by the board. They'd decided. This wasn't a request, it was a promise. I called the HOA number listed at the bottom more out of frustration than anything. No answer. I left a voicemail. I stated my name, the date of my land purchase, the tax parcel number, and the survey reference code. I explained clearly and calmly that my cabin predates the HOA, lies outside their jurisdiction, and is protected by grandfathered property rights. I asked for a callback. I never got one. Instead, a few days later, I noticed a white SUV parked on the trailhead near the lake. Someone was taking photos again, this time from a tripod mounted between the trees. I walked down the hill, boots crunching over dry pine needles, and caught a glimpse of the same clipboard-wielding man I'd seen with Karen. When he spotted me, he quickly packed up his gear and climbed into the vehicle without a word. The next day, I received a packet from the Willow Bend Ridge Compliance Department. It included copies of their bylaws and a form labeled Voluntary Structure Review Request. The note attached was handwritten in elegant script. "We strongly encourage your cooperation before the scheduled compliance review. Respectfully, K. Whitmore." That was the first time I felt the shift. The sense that this was no longer just an overzealous HOA president with a checklist. It was a campaign, a quiet siege. Still, I didn't act. I didn't call a lawyer. Didn't go down to the county office to file an official preemptive injunction. I believed naively, maybe stupidly, that they wouldn't dare touch what wasn't theirs. That no HOA in its right mind would bring in bulldozers for a technicality. But I'd forgotten something critical. Karen wasn't in her right mind. I found that out for certain the following Saturday. There was a neighborhood open house along the main boulevard of Willow Bend. Realtors, HOA members, and potential buyers all buzzing around golf carts and catered food. I went only because the diner in town was closed for a plumbing issue, and the HOA had advertised free pulled pork sandwiches. I should have turned around the second I saw the banner "Celebrate a Unified Vision. Future of the Willow Bend Lakefront." On one of the booths, there was a display, a giant foam board rendering of Lake Harmony redevelopment plan. In it, there were picnic lawns, paddleboard docks, and a trimmed shoreline with modern eco-cabins, all built in sleek lines where my old cabin stood. I stood there staring at it until a woman approached. "You must be Mr. Mayfield," she said brightly, offering a hand. She was young, polished, wearing a name tag that read City Planning Liaison, HOA Partnership Committee. "I'm sorry," I said. "That structure right there, where did you get that image?" "Oh!" she said, glancing over at the board. "That's the Phase 2 expansion model. It's still under review, but we're working closely with the HOA to consolidate some of the privately held shoreline parcels. It's going to really elevate property values." "Privately held?" I asked. "That's my land." She blinked. "Oh, well, I'm sure the board is working with the appropriate parties to—" I didn't let her finish. I walked away, my hands shaking. I went straight to the county records office that Monday. Sure enough, no new filings had been made to claim my land. But there was something else, a recent public complaint log listing my parcel under pending concern for community impact, filed by the Willow Bend Ridge HOA. It wasn't a legal claim, it was a maneuver, a setup. If I didn't push back formally, they could argue neglect abandonment or visual noncompliance. And once those boxes were ticked, their charter allowed for corrective community beautification efforts. In other words, they'd manufactured a path to tear my place down. That night, I drove back to the cabin and sat on the old bench beside the water. The sun dipped behind the hills, and the shadows stretched long across the lake. The valve station buzzed quietly behind me, steady like a heartbeat. I should have fought harder then. I should have lawyered up, should have called the sheriff, but I didn't, because I still believed in the boundary lines, inked on paper. I believed they meant something. I didn't know that Karen Whitmore's favorite hobby was crossing lines no one gave her permission to touch. And I had just given her the perfect opening. It started with a tremor, not the kind you feel beneath your feet, but in the pit of your stomach, where instinct goes before reason catches up. I was up before dawn, as usual, the percolator bubbling on the stove, and the mist curling low over the lake. I had just poured my first cup when the distant metallic clank echoed from the tree line. My first thought was deer fencing. Maybe the growers were reinforcing the irrigation barriers again. But then I heard the engine. Heavy, throaty. Not a truck, not a pickup, a bulldozer. I rushed outside barefoot, still holding the mug eyes scanning past the woods down toward the old trail that cut through the HOA boundary. That's when I saw the flash of yellow between the trees. Earth mover. Big one. And behind it, another vehicle flatbed, hauling equipment. A third truck rolled in behind them, black lettering across the side, Willow Bend Ridge Community Services, authorized entry. I dropped the mug. The ceramic shattered on the deck as I sprinted down the incline, heart pounding in my chest like it hadn't in years. Not since the Gulf. Not since the IED that took my best friend's legs. They were at the gate. 3 men in reflective vests, one of them unlocking the padlock I'd installed myself. A woman stood beside them with a clipboard. "Red windbreaker. Karen," I yelled. It wasn't a word, not at first, just raw sound, primal, loud enough to make one of the workers flinch. They turned surprised. Karen, however, didn't. Harlan, she called, voice calm and perfectly rehearsed. "You were issued final notice. We are authorized under Article 9A to initiate emergency abatement of unsafe structures." I stopped 10 yards from the gate, breathing hard. "This is trespass," I spat. "You're on private land." Karen tilted her head slightly. "Your structure was deemed non-compliant, hazardous, and built within proximity of shared environmental resources. We've exhausted all communication channels. You left us no choice. No court order," I demanded. "Emergency authorization," she said, lifting a document wrapped in a plastic sleeve. "Signed off by our board's legal advisory. Fully enforceable." "Not by the county," I said. "Not by the state." "You had time to respond," she replied. "You chose silence." I looked past her. One of the dozer drivers was starting the engine. The thing roared to life, smoke belching from the exhaust. Another worker was laying plywood to create a ramp over the shallow dip that led to the cabin path. I stepped in front of the gate. "You touch that cabin, I swear to God." Karen stepped forward, face inches from mine. "Stand down, Mr. Mayfield," she said, low and venomous. "This is happening with or without your cooperation. You can file your complaints with the HOA Dispute Committee." I almost hit her. For the first time in my life, my hands curled into fists, not from discipline, but from fury. My ears rang. My vision tunneled. Only the image of my wife's face the night she died, the last time she smiled at me from that porch, kept me from swinging. Instead, I stepped aside. Not because I was beaten, but because something colder had started to settle in my chest. Something harder than grief, deeper than rage. I would remember every license plate, every face, every sound. I would record it, document it, and I would burn their paperwork with my own evidence. I wouldn't stop until they answered for this. The machines rolled past me. I followed on foot. They reached the clearing in minutes. The cabin stood there, quiet and timeless, the early sun casting long shadows across its shingles. For a moment, I thought someone might stop, that one of the workers might look at it, really look, and realize what they were about to destroy. But they didn't. The dozer's blade lifted, and then it began. The sound was worse than I imagined. Not a clean smash, but a splintering shriek, wood being crushed, glass shattering the porch, groaning like an old animal dying slow. The chimney collapsed in a plume of dust. The water barrel was knocked sideways, flooding the grass with the rain collected over weeks. They didn't even hesitate at the bench. I couldn't watch. I turned away, walked down to the shoreline, and stood with my feet in the lake. The water was cold. I let it numb my ankles. Somewhere behind me, I heard a chainsaw start. They were clearing the trees, now my pines, the ones I planted the year my wife passed. The same ones that sheltered birds in the winter, that kept the soil from eroding during spring floods. I thought of the maps, the deeds, the law books stored in a bin under the bed. I thought of the conversations I'd had with Charlie Rutledge, the water right documents signed in ink 3 decades ago. They had built this whole development on the idea that no one would fight back. That a man like me, a widower, a recluse, a quiet veteran, would roll over when pushed. They hadn't counted on what I'd buried beneath the calm. Hours later, it was done. The cabin was gone. Just splinters, bent nails, and wet earth remained. The workers packed up without looking at me. Karen nodded once to the crew and walked back to her SUV like she'd just handled a minor inconvenience. I stayed until dark. The wind picked up around sunset. The air shifted heavy with something unspoken. I stood by the valve gate and looked out at the fields across the ridge where the soybean crop stood in neat, obedient rows. That water, they relied on it. It came from my system, my inlet, my infrastructure. I turned the valve key. Not all the way, just enough. A quiet click, a change in pressure, the beginning of consequences. Let them try to grow something now. Let them try to explain what they did when the town came asking why the lake level dropped, why the crops died, and why a man who had stayed silent for 20 years had finally stopped being quiet. 3 days passed before anyone noticed. It was a dry spring, the kind where the soil turns powdery by mid-morning and stays thirsty well after the sun dips behind the hills. The kind of season where every drop matters. And every drop for those soybean fields came from the network my great-uncle carved by hand, with a mule and spade later upgraded to steel piping and retrofitted by me and the state in 1991. They never should have forgotten that. The first call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then came another, and another. The HOA had my number from old contact records probably pulled from county tax rolls. I listened to the voicemails in the order they came. Mr. Mayfield, this is Jennifer with Willow Bend, Water Coordination. We've had some irregular readings and just wanted to confirm everything's operating normally on your end. Hi, this is Brian Chavez from Airlink Co-op. Our field sensors show pressure loss along the southern main. Are you seeing anything abnormal on the intake? And finally, Karen's voice. Harlan, we need to talk. There's a situation. We believe the lake intake valve might be restricted. Call me. I didn't call. Instead, I drove out to the maintenance bay, across the water where the co-op kept their monitoring equipment. I parked far enough to watch unnoticed. I saw the utility trucks arrive one after another. Men in tan uniforms walked the perimeter, checking junction boxes, opening valve hatches, scratching their heads. What they didn't know, what none of them could figure out, is that the problem wasn't downstream. It was me. At the heart of the whole system was an iron valve the size of a tree stump, painted forest green, bolted to a concrete slab, and locked with a key only I possessed. That valve controlled 70% of the flow toward the southbound line that fed the fields behind Willow Bend's East Road, a line their entire HOA agriculture initiative depended on. They'd built community pride on those soybeans, had local kids take class trips out to the fields, took promotional photos every harvest season with Karen standing in front of the stalks like she personally fertilized the ground. It was more than crops, it was propaganda, a legacy. And now, it was failing. The first signs were subtle. Yellowing leaves, curling stems. By the end of the first week, the soil between rows had begun to crack. The HOA posted a public update, unseasonable weather effects, crop irrigation mitigation measures underway. I watched from the edge of the woods. No one knew I was there, not yet. On the 7th day, Karen showed up at my gate. I saw her through the blinds before she even knocked. Same red windbreaker, though this time she looked less sure of herself. The crisp authority she once walked with had frayed. Her hair wasn't as neatly done. Her clipboard wasn't in hand. Just her alone with nothing but a shaky smile. I opened the door and said nothing. May I come in? She asked. No. Her smile faded. I think we've had misunderstandings. I wanted to apologize. You want water, I replied. Her jaw clenched. Our records indicate you reduced flow intentionally, she said, which under the cooperative agreement signed in 1999 could be interpreted as, that agreement expired in 2009, I interrupted. It was never renewed. You've been operating on assumed access since then. I allowed it because no one bothered me, until you did. She flinched. We didn't know. You didn't ask. Karen looked around as if suddenly realizing how alone we were. The lake behind her shimmered low and still. You could already see the rocks that only surfaced during drought years. We'd like to work something out, she said carefully. There's a special HOA meeting tomorrow. I'd like you to attend. Present your concerns. We're willing to revisit certain decisions. Decisions like destroying my home. She swallowed. We overstepped. That's not an apology. Silence stretched between us. I could feel it pressing down on her. Finally, she tried again. We're willing to offer restitution. I folded my arms. We'll draft a settlement proposal, she added. Monetary compensation. A public acknowledgement. Repairs to the shoreline. It would be better for everyone if we could resolve this internally. No. Karen's voice hardened. You'll be seen as retaliatory. It will reflect poorly, Karen, I said. I don't care how I'm seen. You flattened my wife's memorial bench. You tore apart the one place on earth that still felt like home. You don't get to rewrite the ending. I'm trying to avoid escalation. I already escalated, I said calmly. You're just late to the realization. She stood frozen for a moment, then stepped back. "We'll involve attorneys," she said finally. "You already did," I answered, and I shut the door. Later that night, I opened my safe. Inside were more than just property deeds and survey maps. There were old inspection records, Department of Natural Resources certifications, original infrastructure blueprints signed by state engineers, proof that the entire system pumps pressure nodes belonged to me. And one more thing, a photo of my wife on the porch, her feet up on that carved bench, laughing like she hadn't a care in the world. I set it beside the documents on the table. This wasn't about water anymore. This was about everything they thought they could erase. And I was just getting started. It rained that night, but not enough to matter. A thin drizzle swept across the hills, misting the lake with soft ripples and leaving a hollow scent of wet dust in the air. I sat on the edge of the old concrete platform where the main valve was buried, watching the clouds roll past the moon. Below me, the black surface of the water shimmered with silence. You had to know how to listen to water to understand what it was saying. And tonight it was quiet not because it was still, but because it was holding something back. So was I. The next morning I went to town. I parked outside the courthouse, walked in with my file folder under my arm, and asked to see the public land records officer. Her name was Diane, and she was new, maybe mid-30s, polite but wary, the kind of civil servant who hadn't yet learned that apathy was easier than outrage. She didn't recognize me at first. Then she saw the parcel number I wrote down. "Oh," she said softly. "You're the one with the lake cabin." I nodded. "There's been some attention on this," she added, opening the records database on her screen. "A lot of recent access logs." "HOA requests?" I asked. She hesitated. "Mostly." They filed a report claiming the property had been in disrepair, that it was no longer a residence. Claimed public hazard due to abandoned structure. And what did the county do? "Nothing. Your taxes are current, ownership is clear, and no inspections were requested through official channels." She paused. "They went around us." I nodded unsurprised. Then I slid the file folder across the desk. Inside were the original water infrastructure deeds, the transfer documents signed by Charlie Rutledge in 2003, and a notarized copy of the intake valve design schematic with my signature and license number from my time with the Army Corps. On top of that sat photographs of the demolished cabin, the damaged shoreline, and a list of field sensor readings showing the drop in pressure since I reduced the outflow. Diane scanned the first few pages, then looked up. "You planning to file a grievance?" "Not yet," I said. "I'm documenting." "Preparing a case." She gave a slow nod. "Do you need copies? Make 5 sets," I said. "1 for your office, 1 for the water authority, 1 for the sheriff, 2 for me." As she stood to make the copies, I glanced out the window across the square. A news van had pulled up near the town hall. Their logo was small local, the kind of channel that mostly covered bake sales and lost pets. But lately, they'd been hovering near Willow Bend. The story was spreading. Back at home, the fields had begun to yellow. The soybean leaves, usually glossy and wide, now hung limp from their stalks. Dust blew between the rows, clinging to boots and tires. The growers hired by the HOA began to complain quietly at first, then loudly about yield loss, dry root systems, and inexplicable system failure. They replaced sensors. They checked the timers. Nothing changed, because I had turned the valve again. This time I shut it almost entirely. Only a trickle remained, just enough to keep suspicion at bay, to make them think the problem was mechanical. But the real reason sat buried in rusted iron beneath my land, inside a lock they couldn't break, and a pipe they couldn't reach without crossing a legal line they no longer dared to touch. They sent letters, certified, hand-delivered. One even came with a courier service. Each one used stronger language: willful obstruction, breach of community trust, malicious interference with agricultural resources. I didn't respond. Instead, I began gathering affidavits. 3 neighbors from the outer loop of Willow Bend came to me after hearing what happened. One was an elderly widow named Margie Dobbins, whose rose garden had been redesigned by the HOA's landscaping committee without permission. Another was a younger couple whose backyard shed had been fined for being non-conforming, even though it had stood there since the property was built. The third was a local handyman, former Marine, who had once been fined $1,000 for parking his work trailer on the street for less than an hour. They were angry. More importantly, they were willing to talk. We met quietly in my barn, away from HOA ears. I recorded their statements. I took photos of their letters, emails, citations, and notices. We formed a timeline. We charted a pattern, one of overreach, intimidation, and administrative abuse masquerading as community beautification. The real story wasn't just my cabin. It was a pattern of control. Karen had built her HOA into a fiefdom. She used bylaws as weapons and committees as shields. But what she didn't count on, what people like her never counted on, was what happens when the quiet ones get organized. I contacted a lawyer named Terrence Myers, older, semi-retired, with a reputation for hating HOAs. He'd taken on 3 similar cases in the last 5 years and won all of them. He agreed to meet after reviewing my file. His first question: "Do you have a smoking gun?" I handed him a USB drive. "It's a recording," I said, of Karen admitting the cabin demolition was approved internally without any county coordination. I recorded it on my porch. She didn't know. Terrence smiled slowly. "That'll do." He filed an official tort claim within the week, naming the HOA board, the president, the property officer, and the private demolition contractor as defendants in an unlawful destruction and trespass case, seeking damages for property loss, emotional distress, and environmental violation. Word spread fast. By the time the next HOA board meeting convened, it wasn't in their clubhouse, it was in the town gymnasium, moved due to high community interest. Over 100 residents showed up. So did the press. Karen tried to maintain control, but the questions kept coming. About the soy fields, about the water, about the demolished cabin, about her failure to coordinate with the county. Then someone, one of the neighbors from our little group, stood and asked, "If Mr. Mayfield owns the water system, why have we been pretending the HOA does silence?" That was the moment the narrative cracked. I watched Karen's face from the back row. It was the first time she looked afraid. The letterhead said Kaufman, Slater & Briggs, a firm I recognized. High-priced, loud corporate. The kind of firm HOAs hire when they want to make someone feel outgunned. The packet they sent was thick, certified. Delivered by a man in a gray suit who didn't meet my eyes when he handed it over. I opened it at the kitchen table, the one I'd dragged out of the rubble and propped up on bricks in my barn like some relic from a better time. Inside 36 pages of legal language, most of it inflated nonsense. The first half demanded the immediate restoration of full irrigation service to all Willow Bend adjacent community agricultural zones, citing implied easement and historic cooperative use. The second half was a threat couched in legalese but clear as day. If I didn't comply, the HOA would seek an emergency injunction and pursue damages for lost crop revenue and willful negligence. It was all bluff. They had no deed, no access easement, no contract in force. I'd checked it all twice with Terrence. Still, the intent was obvious. They weren't just trying to restore the water. They were trying to scare me. I called Terrence that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. "They're threatening a lawsuit," I said. "Of course they are," he replied, calm as ever. "They're hoping to shake you down before the truth goes public. What's our next move?" He chuckled softly. "We don't flinch. I've already filed our own motion to dismiss their injunction, and we're petitioning the court to open a formal discovery process into HOA internal communications about your property. You think they'll settle? Not yet. Karen's not the backing down type, but give it time. They always crumble when the lights come on." He was right. The pressure was mounting. The local news had picked up the story. Their headline the next morning read, "Homeowner Fights Back After HOA Bulldozes. Cabin Legal Battle Brews Over Lake Water Rights." It was accompanied by a photo of me standing beside the ruined slab of my cabin arms, crossed with the lake in the background, and the wilted soybean field just over the ridge. Within hours, a storm of public comments flooded the HOA's website. People were furious. Not just for me, but for themselves. Dozens began sharing their own stories of fines, threats, and intrusive compliance checks. A second HOA meeting was announced, this time emergency only. Closed door, no residents, but the damage was done. Karen tried to change the narrative. She issued a public statement calling the cabin a safety hazard and claimed the demolition was done in alignment with the community's long-term vision for shared space and wellness. She even used the phrase aesthetically necessary. That made people angrier. Meanwhile, the soy fields continued to die. You could smell it now, the sharp, sour scent of decaying vegetation under heat. Flies gathered. Crop rot began to set in along the south edges. Farmers brought in portable water tanks, but it wasn't enough. They started losing acres by the day. The co-op, once proud partners of the HOA, started pulling away. Then came the visit I didn't expect. It was late evening when the knock came. I thought it was Terrence or maybe one of the neighbors, but it was Karen. No windbreaker this time. No clipboard. Just her, in a gray blouse and slacks, standing on my gravel path with her shoulders squared and eyes tired. She looked 10 years older than the last time I saw her. I didn't invite her in. We stood outside between the trees and the lake, under a sky full of bruised clouds. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. "I don't owe you anything," I replied. "I know." For the first time, she looked human. Not a tyrant in a red jacket, but a woman who had built a throne out of bylaws and now found herself sinking into the mud beneath it. "You win," she said. I narrowed my eyes. I can't keep the board together. 3 members have resigned. The co-op pulled their endorsement. The county's opened a formal review of our charter. We're hemorrhaging money defending ourselves against your claim. I said nothing. "I didn't think it would go this far," she continued. "I thought you'd back down. Everyone does." "That was your mistake." She nodded. "I made a lot of them." There was a long silence. Then, to my surprise, she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse. "I brought a draft settlement," she said. "Not from the board, from me." I hesitated. "It's not just about avoiding court," she said. "It's about fixing something. We can't undo what we did to your home, but we can make it right publicly." I took the paper. "Read it by fading daylight. Restitution, public apology, HOA-funded reconstruction of a memorial structure on my property to my specifications, full legal acknowledgement of my water rights, a pledge to revise HOA governance rules under third-party oversight." It wasn't everything, but it was more than I thought she was capable of. I folded the paper. "I'll consider it," I said. "But my lawyer sees it first." "Of course," she replied. Then she turned to go. "Karen," I called. She paused. "Why'd you do it? Why target me in the first place?" She stared out at the lake for a long time. "Because I thought silence meant permission," she said. And then she walked away. When I walked into the town council chambers 2 nights later, the energy in the room was electric. Not loud, not chaotic, but charged in that way you feel in your teeth. Rows of folding chairs had been added, yet still people stood against the back wall. It wasn't just HOA members anymore. It was residents from every edge of the county, reporters, students with notepads, older couples whispering to each other, and a man holding a sign that read, "Justice for the Lake Cabin." I never asked for that. But I didn't turn away from it either. Karen was already seated up front, flanked by the 2 remaining HOA board members, and a young man in a navy suit who looked like he regretted accepting this retainer. Her eyes darted up when I entered, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't before, maybe not regret, but recognition. The kind that only comes when someone realizes the story has grown beyond them. The town moderator, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Whitman, tapped the microphone twice and called the session to order. This wasn't an HOA meeting, it was an open town forum. And by the number of yellow speaker request cards on the table, people were ready to talk. Tonight's session will address public concern regarding the actions of the Willow Bend Ridge Homeowners Association and the recent impact on private property rights, community resources, and infrastructure management, Gerald began. We remind everyone to remain civil. I was the third speaker called. When my name was announced, a hush fell over the room. I rose slowly, not for drama, but because the last few weeks had lived in my bones like bad weather. I walked to the podium, unfolded my notes, and didn't read from them. "I'm Harlan Mayfield," I said. "I'm a retired engineer. I've lived beside Willow Bend Lake for 19 years. My family's owned our plot since 1942. That cabin wasn't just mine. It was my wife's, my father's, and my great-uncle's before him. It stood longer than Willow Bend has existed. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, without a court order or legal notice, that cabin was destroyed by a bulldozer sent by the HOA. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I held up the photo one the reporters had already published. The rubble, the broken bench, the splintered frame of what had once been a home. They claimed safety. They claimed aesthetics. But what they never claimed, because they couldn't, was ownership. My deed says what it says. The county has the records. They knew they didn't have authority, and they acted anyway. I let that hang. Then I unfolded another paper. This is the original intake valve permit. Registered 1974, updated 1, and transferred to me in 2003. It controls water for the Southern Field Irrigation Network. For years, the HOA used that water without agreement, contract, or payment. I let it continue because peace was easier than paperwork. Now came the twist. But when they leveled my home, I closed the valve. Not in anger, in defense. And now they claim I'm the threat. I stepped back from the podium. The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. A woman in the second row, Margie Dobbins, widow of a Korean War vet and lifelong resident, raised her hand. Gerald nodded, and she stood. "My rose garden," she said firmly, voice cracking slightly. They cut it down, said it was too disruptive to sidewalk continuity. 50 years those bushes stood. I never gave permission. Another hand went up, then another. A man spoke about being fined for a basketball hoop nailed to a tree. A young mother spoke of cameras installed near her yard. A contractor testified about being blacklisted from doing repairs in the HOA zone after quoting a job too low. And then a voice I didn't expect. Karen Whitmore, president of the Willow Bend Ridge HOA. All eyes turned to her. Karen stood slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone in particular. "I take responsibility for the demolition of Mr. Mayfield's cabin," she said. "I did not pursue county coordination. I believed we had jurisdiction. I was wrong." Gasps. Rippled, then silence. She continued. "The HOA failed to respect property boundaries. We overstepped in our interpretation of enforcement. We allowed a culture of control to override our duty of service. I offer my formal resignation as president, effective immediately." Someone in the back clapped. Then someone else. Soon the room was standing, not in applause, not in celebration, but in relief. The kind that comes when a weight finally lifts, when truth breaks the surface after being held underwater too long. Later that evening, as people filed out, reporters surrounded me. Microphones, lights, questions. I gave only one statement. This was never about revenge. It was about remembering that property, like people, deserves respect. The town clerk met me near the exit. She handed me a manila envelope. "We've processed the filings," she said. "Your tort case has been registered with the county docket. You'll get your court date soon." I nodded. "Also," she hesitated, "someone left this for you." She handed me a sealed envelope, no name. Inside was a photo of my cabin years ago, still whole. My wife sitting on the steps with a fishing pole across her lap. On the back, a handwritten note. "I saw her every morning. She always waved. I never said hello. I wish I had. I'm sorry." No signature. Just an anonymous piece of humanity, one final offering of grace. That night, I returned to the lake and sat by the valve, the moonlight turning the surface silver. The cabin was gone. But something deeper had returned. A voice, a boundary, a truth that no windbreaker could flatten. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. It smelled like old wood and hand sanitizer, and the walls were lined with portraits of long-dead judges whose eyes seemed to follow everyone who entered. I sat on the left side with Terrence beside me, his tie a little crooked but his focus razor-sharp. Across the aisle sat the HOA's remaining counsel. Two attorneys from Kaufman, Slater, and Briggs, flipping through binders as if they could flip away guilt with paper. Karen sat at the defense table alone. She wore black, not her usual sharp red or corporate gray. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot, and her eyes were hollow in a way I hadn't seen since the night she showed up at my cabin with that folded settlement paper. She didn't look at me not once, not when I entered, not when the judge called the hearing to order, not even when the photos of the demolished cabin were handed to the clerk. The judge, a woman named Margot Lee, was known for her intolerance of nonsense. I'd seen her once before, years ago, in a case involving a neighbor's disputed septic line. That case took 15 minutes. She'd ruled without fanfare and left both parties stunned with her clarity. This one was going to take longer. The case was structured around two key allegations. First, the unlawful demolition of a private residence without county approval or court-ordered authorization. And second, the unauthorized use and obstruction of a private water system essential to public agricultural infrastructure. In short, they tore down my home, and they did it while depending on my water. Terrence began calmly. He presented the deed, first clean notarized and recorded decades ago. Then came the valve control permits, the grandfathered water rights, the engineering schematics, and a stack of correspondence from me to the HOA, most of which had gone unanswered. Then he handed over the recording. Karen's voice, clear and certain. We didn't go through the county. We didn't need to. He wasn't going to fight us. The judge's pen froze for a moment. And that's when Terrence made his move. Your Honor, he said, stepping forward, this was not a mistake. This was a pattern. The HOA operated as if law bowed to their charter. They used fear, silence, and intimidation to enforce rules they had no right to enforce. And they assumed that no one would ever challenge them. Until someone did. The room was still. Only the soft clicking of a reporter's keyboard broke the silence. Then, it was the defense's turn. Their lead attorney, a man with slicked back hair and the tone of a man who'd never spent a day outside an office, stood with practiced sympathy. There is no denying, Your Honor, that unfortunate decisions were made. But we contend that the HOA acted in good faith. They believed the structure to be abandoned. They believed their emergency powers granted them leeway to act. Judge Lee raised an eyebrow. Do you have documentation to support that belief? Only internal meeting notes and the charter's emergency provisions. Any record of a filed permit county notification court order? No, Your Honor. And the structure in question, was it on land within the HOA's jurisdiction? He hesitated. Technically, no. Judge Lee turned the page in her binder. So we have a governing body with no legal authority demolishing private property and leveraging infrastructure it does not own. Counsel, do you see the issue? He nodded slowly. We do now. When it came time for Karen to speak, she stood without prompting. No attorney rose beside her. For a moment, I almost pitied her. I was wrong, she said simply. That was it. No speech. No spin. Just those 3 words, brittle and breaking. Judge Lee took a long breath. I find sufficient cause to proceed to trial on the grounds of trespass, unlawful destruction of property, and damages related to infrastructure interference. Additionally, I will be referring this case to the County Charter Review Committee for potential suspension of HOA privileges pending the outcome. Her gavel struck once. It was done for now. Afterward, outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. Terrence handled most of the questions. I stood at the edge of the steps, feeling the warm spring air stir through the trees as if something had shifted, something fundamental. A young man in jeans and a camera slung over his shoulder approached me, notebook in hand. Mr. Mayfield, he said. What happens next? I looked out at the horizon where the lake shimmered just beyond the courthouse roof. I rebuild, I said. He scribbled it down. And the HOA. They reckon with what they built. That night, I drove back out to the lake. The soy fields were bare now, cleared in anticipation of a replanting season that wouldn't come. The ground cracked in places, soft in others, as if nature hadn't decided whether to forgive or bury. I walked the shoreline where the cabin used to stand. The rubble had long since been cleared, but I could still see the outline, the old porch, the corner beam where the wood stove sat, the place where my wife's bench had once looked out across the water. I took off my boots and stepped into the lake. It was cold, pure. The valve control box still stood like a monument at the edge. I knelt beside it and unlocked the access panel. For the first time in months, I turned the dial slowly. The water surged gentle at first, then steady. I didn't do it for them, not for Karen, not for the HOA. I did it because this land had been starved long enough. And because justice, when it comes, shouldn't taste of salt. It should taste of rain. I built the new bench with my own hands. It wasn't ornate, just cedar and galvanized bolts, sturdy and square. But I carved the seat rail the way she used to like it, rounded and smooth, so it wouldn't dig into the backs of your legs when you sat for too long watching the water. I placed it on the exact footprint of the old one facing west across the lake. From that spot, if you sat real still, you could watch the ducks come in low over the reeds, just like she used to. And this time, I carved both our names into the side. The rubble was gone, but the ground still held memory. You could feel it in the quiet, in the way the wind came off the lake and touched your face different there, like it remembered who stood there before. Some places stay sacred, whether or not a building remains. Karen never came back. The county trial moved forward, and though the HOA's lawyers did what lawyers do, stall shift, threatened the facts, didn't bend. Depositions from board members who had resigned told the full story. The vote to demolish had been rushed, undocumented, and pushed by Karen herself under the guise of preserving community aesthetic integrity. The court ruled in my favor. I was awarded full damages for the structure, every nail beam and fixture. More than that, the court imposed an injunction. The HOA was barred from conducting enforcement actions outside its clearly defined jurisdiction, and a formal county oversight committee was established to audit HOA operations every quarter for the next 5 years. Karen faced civil penalties, and more devastating for her public loss of reputation. She didn't just lose her role, she became a cautionary tale in real estate seminars and law blogs, the president who bulldozed too far. I took a portion of the settlement, not all, and used it to rebuild something modest. Not a cabin this time, not really. More like a shelter. A single-room retreat, open air, on one side with a roof for rain and a cot in the corner. I didn't need much, just a place to sit, to listen, and to remember. The bench stayed outside. Sometimes the neighbors visit. Margie Dobbins brought me a rosebush cutting from her old garden, the one the HOA tore out. We planted it near the stone marker I had carved with my wife's initials. The young couple with the shed that had once been fined brought over fresh lumber and helped me build a small footbridge across the drainage path that used to flood. And the ex-Marine handyman showed up unannounced one Saturday with a thermos of black coffee and a toolbox. He didn't say a word, just handed me a wrench and started fixing the dock. It was never about just me. When power goes unchecked, it spreads like mold, quiet, unseen, until it touches everything. But when someone pushes back, when someone says no more, the cracks let in light. One evening, as summer finally leaned in, I got a letter. No envelope, just a folded note left in the mailbox tied to my fence with a string. It read, "You reminded us this land isn't just managed, it's lived on. Thank you." No signature, just that, and I think that was enough. The lake filled again. Slowly, quietly, the shoreline returned to its old self. The ducks came back. The fish stirred beneath the surface, and the soy fields. They were fallow for a season. But eventually, new growers came in, ones who signed real agreements, ones who sat at my table, shook my hand and said please instead of comply. We worked out a water-sharing plan with the county's help. Sustainable, legal, fair. Not everything heals, though. There are still mornings when I reach for the coffee pot and expect to hear her humming in the next room. Or I find myself pausing at the sound of tires on gravel, half expecting another clipboard and windbreaker on the other side of the gate. But then I look out across the lake and remember that the silence now means something else. Not fear, not grief. Peace. It comes slow, like water through a valve, but once it flows, it stays. I sit on the bench sometimes and trace the letters in the wood. Our names side by side. I speak to her out loud when no one's around. I kept it safe, I say. Even when they tried to take it, I kept it safe. And if I listen closely, I swear the wind answers, not with words, just with stillness. And in that stillness, I know she hears me.